All right, Shabbos, say good morning, good morning. Let us begin. Beautiful daf ahead of us today. Short daf, beautiful daf. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors. Just had it here a moment ago. I'm sorry. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev. To thank Josh and Becca Friedman for dedicating all the shurim this month. Be'ilu Nishmas Josh Esfadi Yisrael Yehuda B'Rav Chaim Rafael. To thank Simi and Malka Esterson for dedicating all the shurim this month in memory of their parents. Yitzchak Leib Ben Aaron HaKohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram, Hinda Bas Henech Ephraim, and in the Zuchos of the continued health and nachas from Mr. Morton Esterson Admeh Ve'esrim Shanim Tovos. To thank the Pepper family for dedicating the shurim this month in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Shmuel's brother Yosef Pepper, Yosef David Zichron Lebracha Ben Yaakov. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Hillary and Akiva Kent, in memory of Hillary's father, Tzvi Hirsch Ben Chanoch. And to thank our Daf Yomi sponsors, beautiful sponsor, David and Malki Kramer, in honor of the Daf Yomi shift for making a siyum on Art Scroll Nedarim Volume 1. This is the first. And beginning Art Scroll Nedarim Volume 2, and with Hakaras Hatov, to the Shir, for the enthusiasm each and every day. And Baruch Hashem, we've completed 29 Art Scroll volumes in the past 3 years. Beautiful, beautiful. Sounds like a commercial. Baruch Hashem, right? Then you can order here, right? So let's say we thank the Kramers for that beautiful dedication. Hallelujah. We should be Zochem Yirtzeh Hashem to finish many more volumes together. All right, we'll say, let's get to work. So not a lot of Gemara today, but Baruch Hashem, a lot of fantastic concepts and a lot of really interesting halacha l'maisa. So today's daf is Memhei 45. We are picking up at Yirtzeh Hashem on 44b. 44b at the Mesa. We actually did the Mesa yesterday, but let's just pick up there again. 1, 2, 3 lines down. So we'll say, so just to reorient ourselves a little bit. The fundamental machlokis that we are dealing with over here is the machlokis Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanon, which emanates in the Mishnah. That machlokis ultimately again is talking about the mechanism of hefker. Very quickly, the Rabbanon hold once you make something hefker, just the declaration of hefker, it has left your ownership. Rabbi Yossi, it never really leaves your ownership until when? Until ultimately, again, someone else acquires it. The nafkamina between those two opinions was the case in the Mishnah. Reuven made a neder that Shimon can't benefit from him. They're traveling together. Reuven has food. Shimon doesn't have any food. Reuven wants to get food to Shimon, but he doesn't know how. The Rabbanan say, just put it down, make it hefker. Shimon can pick it up. Rabbi Yossi says, no, that's not the way it works. Hefker does not work that way. Hefker will require ultimately a third party ultimately to acquire, because again, according to Rabbi Yossi, if Shimon picks it up and acquires it, quote unquote, from Hefker, really he's acquiring it directly from Reuven, which is a problem with the neder. So we'll say we then saw the Gemara dealt with the svar of Rabbi Yossi. We had a brisa, then we had a machlokus in Ula and Reish Lakish. Ultimately, again, how to understand the brisa. Good. So that's the summary. Let's pick up. Meisi Gemara Zekasha Hamafkires Karmo Ula Shachar Amadu Batzro. So let's listen to this. A person makes his vineyard hefker. Okay, so this is a case of hefker. I make my vineyard hefker. Now something interesting happens the next morning. Ula Shachar the next morning Amad Ubatzro. I come and I harvest the field. Now I will say the shaila that's really coming up over here is what's happening when I harvest the field? Am I just providing a service for a hefker field, or am I effectively reacquiring that field? That's the fundamental issue involved over here. So what's the halacha? Chayiv beperet uba ololos uba shichacha uba peah. So we'll say I am chayiv in peret ololos shichacha peah. So again, we discussed all of this yesterday. So we'll say peret and ololos represent, the different tzedakahs that you have to leave in a field. Just like again, by a field there's leket, there's shichacha. If you drop a stalk, you drop a bushel. So too again, by peret and ololos, peret is if you end up leaving grapes on the vine. Ololos are underdeveloped clusters that if you did not go ahead and pick them, you leave them on the vine. See, interestingly enough, in this case, if I made the vineyard hefker and then I go back and I harvest it, so the vineyard is subject to the halachos of peret and ololos, shichacha and peah, but pater from meiser. Now, I will say, if you take a quick look at the Ran, so the Ran, we actually did this yesterday, but just to kind of catch us up, the Ran is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 lines up from the bottom. So Meisei Mafkis Kamar Ulu Shachar Amaru Batzro Chayve Parit to Olos of Shicha Peah Mishum Da'afagav the Hefker Patra Mikulu. Now, here's what's interesting. Generally, we would assume that a field that is hefker, in other words, one of the things we've seen is that a field that is hefker is what? Is pater from maisus, right? So it's interesting that this field is going to be chayiv in peret, ololos, shechacha, and peah, kedarmina ba'alma, nishmar lemiute hefker, afilu hachi, mishum de bekulhu hanik siv ta'azov yisera, mechayiv behu kolecha shehichsik ba, hu atzmo ba'achi paragos. Supposed to listen to this. The idea over here is peret, ololos, peret, ololos, shechacha, and peah are unique. Why are they unique? Because the Torah discusses, ultimately, again, the Torah uses the word ta'azov, if you leave them, which means, without getting into the entire drasha, which effectively means that by these tzedakos, or by these, we'll call them, I don't want to call them tithes, we'll call them gifts, by these gifts to the poor, if you exhibit any level of ownership over the produce is chayiv, even if you are not the titular owner, right? So I want to point out something very interesting. Up until now, we've always been assuming that only if there is actual ownership is a field subject to the various gifts and tithes. What we're now seeing is that in the world of gifts and tithes, there's titular ownership, and there's, I guess, what we'll call, for lack of a better term, circumstantial or perceived ownership, which is, for example, so in this case over here, I made my vineyard hefker, but then the next morning I'm harvesting it. So I'll say, am I the owner? Am I the owner of the vineyard? Am I the owner? No. Why? I made a hefker. Do I look like the owner? Absolutely. Why? Because I'm harvesting it. So what's interesting is like this. So let's say, for example, Meiser. Meiser is the din in titular ownership. Who has title? Who actually owns it? If you don't own it, the field is not subject to Meiser. Yet, interestingly enough, Peret, Ololos, Shechacha, and Peah is not a din in titular ownership, but rather it's a din in circumstantial or perceived ownership. So because I am the one who is harvesting this over here, and again, I will say that's a drasha that's based on the psukim themselves. Fine. So I will say, if you take a look at the next round, Pater min ha-meiser, Techemid lo ksiv ha-meiser, ta'azov yisera, lo shnahu, v'lo shna achar de pater. Fine. So I will say, says the Gemara, so that's the case. Bishlama le'ula. So according to Ula, I will say this makes sense. The Rabbanon katani la. The Rabbanon are the authors, ultimately, again, of this particular brayso. V'daraisa katani la, and this is in line with biblical law. So take a look at the Ran again, second wide line in the Ran. Bishlama le'ula d'Rabbanon katani daraisa katani la. Kilamar da'afa gav d'tikun Rabbanon d'toch shloshi yachol lachzer bo. Remember again, even though we said before, going back to the beginning of yesterday's sugya, Chazal instituted something interesting by Hefker. What do they institute by Hefker? Say, what happens after you make something Hefker? What happens? You have 3 days to walk back that declaration. I will say, by the way, I just want to clarify something. Rabbi Josh and I were talking about this yesterday after the shir. When we speak about the concept of walking back a declaration of Hefker, that's fundamentally different than acquiring something from Hefker, right? Walking back the declaration means what? The field was never Hefker. As opposed to acquiring something from Hefker, where it becomes yours, what's an nafkamina? If you acquire something from Hefker, the field is pater from Meiser. If you walk back your declaration of Hefker, it was never Hefker. If it was never Hefker, then of course it's subject to all the different truma, which we'll call Meisrus. So listen, I watch this. So it says the Gemara, this statement makes sense according to Ula. Why? Back to the Ran. Kilomar da'afa gav the tikun rabbanan toch shloshi yachol lachzer bo. Even though Chazal said within 3 days you have the ability to walk back your declaration of Hefker. The chayvan shekain ki zachabu chay b'maiser midrabanan. So afilu hachi ki asya hach alibayu shapir deposit to come midaraisa katani. Aval midrabanan einachinam dechay. So we'll say, listen to this. See, here's what's driving the Gemara. So let me get this straight. I have a vineyard. I made it Hefker. So I'll say, now what happens? The next morning, I go back and I harvest it. Now we'll say, harvesting is a proprietary act. We said before that halacha l'maisa, you could walk back your declaration of Hefker within the first 3 days, which sounds like if I perform a proprietary act within the first 3 days, by definition, I have voided my Hefker declaration. So Ula says like this. Ula says, at the end of the day, that is a din d'Rabbanan. Mid-Araisa, once you make something Hefker, we'll say what happened, what's the halacha? It's Hefker. There's no 3 days. It's Chazal who walked in and said the 3 days. Well, remember again, we saw this in yesterday's that. Why did Chazal put that 3-day window? Why did they put that 3-day window? Because the people are trying to exploit the Hefker system. Really what Chazal were saying is, by the way, if you make something Hefker and you reacquire it in 3 days, that Hefker declaration is void. Because that shows you were just trying to, you the owner, were just trying to exploit the loophole. So the way they phrase it is if you make something Hefker, you could walk it back within 3 days, making it as if, almost as if like I have had a change of heart. In reality, it's not about my change of heart. It's about me trying to exploit the system. That's what's happening over here. So according to Ula, therefore, what the Gemara is saying is like this: Midarai. So when you make something hefker, it's hefker. It's hefker. And therefore, again, if you go ahead and you reacquire it, right? Ultimately, again, when it says that it's I'm sorry. So therefore, again, according to Ula, ultimately, again, mid'oraisa this will work. But midrabanan, ultimately, again, it will be chayiv. However, Elul Reish Lakish, amai pater min amaiser. But according to Reish Lakish's interpretation of from yesterday, ultimately, again, why would it be pater from maiser? It should be chayiv in maiser as well. Amar lecha, Reish Lakish will say to you, ki amri ana l'Rabbi Yossi. Right? Ultimately, again, Reish Lakish will say, my opinion is in accordance with Rabbi Yossi. Ha Rabbanan he. But this ultimately, again, reflects the view of the Rabbanan. Fine. Top of Memhei. I will say, now watch this. Another possibility. Now I will say, again, the challenge with these Gemaras, even though the dapim are short, I will say almost every single one of these pieces is asking myself that question for 2 days, right? How do we get ourselves into this? So I will say, remember again, like I said before, this whole thing began with a machlokes, Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanon. What's the machlokes, Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanon? What's the machlokes? Reuven made a Nedar. Reuven said, Nedar, Shimon, you can't benefit from me. Reuven and Shimon are now traveling together on the road. Reuven has food, Shimon doesn't have food. Reuven wants to somehow get food to Shimon, but he can't. Because again, if he gives food to Shimon, then Shimon is benefiting from Reuven. So the Rabbanan say, no problem, Reuven, put the food down on the ground, say, this is Hefker. Walk away. You don't have to walk away. Right? Just say it's Hefker. Shimon could come along and take it. Rabbi Yossi says, no. That's not, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. So we'll say, now watch this. The Gemara says, maybe their machlokes is in Mitzias. Watch this. Iboy Sema, Hadda Afgrei Ba'an Petren, Vahadda Afgrei Ba'ape Tlasa. Ooh. Maybe I will say their machlokes ultimately is how you're making the object Hefker. Rabbi Yossi is talking about a case where you're only making it hefker in front of 2 people. Making something hefker in front of 2 people is not going to work. The Rabbanan, on the other hand, hold the case where you're making it hefker in front of 3 people. So I will say, so maybe they're really not arguing about the mechanics of hefker. They're arguing about the number of people in front of whom you made your hefker declaration. So the Rabbanan are talking about a case where you're making hefker in front of 3. That'll work. Rabbi Yossi says we're talking about a case where you're making it hefker in front of 2. That will not work. We'll say, take a look at the rush for just a moment. We'll say, top rush, right-hand column. V'asi shaper Rabbi Yossi hadika amr b'masisin delo habe hefker ad asli yadzocha hani mili ba'ape trey. When Rabbi Yossi says that the item that's hefker does not become the property of the person who acquires it until it comes to his hand, that's talking about a case Reuven made the item hefker in front of 2 people. Aval ba'ape tlasa dahave hefker mefursam mod Rabbi Yossi diyatza merushuso dahave hefker upater min hamaiser. Wow. Rabbi Yossi, so now what we're saying is like this. Maybe the machlokes is not really a machlokes in the mechanics. I mean, it is a machlokes in the mechanics of hefker, but it's a machlokes in mitzias. According to the Rabbanan, the case is where, according to Rabbi Yossi, let me say, the case is where there are 2 people who are present. Making something hefker in front of 2 people, I will say, is, in the words of the Rush, not mefursam. It's not public. We're going to discuss it with the news at the moment. And because it's not public, therefore, again, it doesn't really leave the ownership of Reuven until it gets to the hands of Shimon. That, says Rabbi Yossi, is a problem, right? That's a problem in our case. Why? Because if the object in question, the food in question, does not leave the domain of Reuven until it gets to the hands of Shimon, then it turns out that what? That Reuven is giving something to Shimon, and that's a violation of the neder. But even Rabbi Yossi would agree that when the hefker is made in front of 3 people, then it's mefursam, then it's public. That item leaves the ownership of Reuven in totality at the time of the declaration, and therefore Shimon would be able to go ahead and take possession of it without being in violation of the neder. Incredible, incredible. So we'll say, so now watch this. The Gemara says, "Dam Rabbi Yochanan, Mishra Rabbi Shimon Yotzadok," because Rabbi Yochanan says this in the name of Rabbi Shimon Yotzadok. Kala mafkir b'fnei shlosha havi hefker. If you make something hefker in front of three people, it's hefker. It's hefker. B'fnei shnayim lo havi hefker. In front of two people, it's not hefker. So we'll say fascinating distinction between making hefker in front of two versus, we'll say now take a look at the Ran. So we'll say, so the Ran is in the wide lines, 2, 4, 5 lines into the wide lines. Dam Rabbi Yochanan kol hamafkir b'fnei shlosha havi hefker mishum da'adaita tukoli alma afkere. When you make something hefker in front of two people, ultimately, again, that's a public statement. And therefore, again, you're making it al das tukoli alma, almost like it's a public statement. B'fnei shnayim lo havi hefker. We'll say, listen to this. T'chivan deleka kala adaita dido b'lachud afkere v'dami l'matana. So we'll say, this is absolutely fascinating. What the Ran posits is like this. When you make something hefker in front of two people, there's not really a publicity to it. Not a publicity to it. If there's not a publicity associated with it, I will say, the world doesn't know about it. What is that like? That's like a matana. It's like you're giving a gift. In front of three people, there is a publicity to it. Where there's a publicity to it, that's hefker. I will say, so now everyone knows, so to speak, right? Three people have a call. Everyone knows that I've made this hefker. That's hefker, because now the public, so to speak, knows the item is ownerless and anyone could take it. You say it in front of two people, that really lacks the element of publicity. Because it lacks the element of publicity, it's not really hefker. What do I call that? A matana. Now we'll say, now this is Rabbi Yossi's model. Therefore, in Rabbi Yossi's world, now again remember, when you make a matana, you give a gift to someone. So we'll say, I'm giving a gift to Ruvain. When does that gift become Ruvain's? When does it become Ruvain's? When he acquires it, right? In other words, if I take a gift and I put the gift down on the table, I say, Ruvain, that's for you. Ruvain doesn't own it yet. He owns it. So Rabbi Yossi will say, hefker in front of two people is like a matana. And just like in the same way that a matana is only acquired by the recipient, when the recipient takes possession of it, so to hefker made in front of two people also only goes ahead and becomes the property of the recipient once he takes possession. Now again, for our case over here by Nedarim, that's problematic. Because in that case, it turns out that when Shimon takes the food, he's really getting it from whose possession? From Ruvain's. And therefore, Ruvain is giving something to Shimon, conveying benefit to Shimon. That's in violation of the Neder. So I will say, this is absolutely mind-blowing. So this is really fascinating. So now what we're saying is, really it's a function of how many people you make the hefker declaration in front of. In front of two, it's not really public. And therefore, again, versus if the neder is made in front of three, that's public. That's public, right? That has like a pirsum, a publicity associated with it. And everyone, even Rabbi Yossi would agree that in the case of three, once Ruvain makes it hefker, he no longer has any ownership interest in it. And if Shimon were to take it, it'd be totally fine. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shmuel Levi argues, he says, no. Devar Torah, afilu be'echad havi hefker. Not true. So once Rabbi Shmuel Levi comes along and says, guys, absolutely not true. You could even make something hefker in front of one person, and that works. You don't need two, you don't need three. A hefker declaration in front of one person works. So we'll say, so why does the number three come up at all in the context of hefker? In other words, if you can make something hefker in front of one person, why does three come up? So it's actually absolutely incredible. Kidei she'eh echad zocha ushnayim me'idin. So I will say, here's what's interesting. Why does three come up? Three comes up, and I will say, because three is a good number. Why is three a good number? Because listen to this. If you have three people who are there, then one could acquire the item, and two can testify about the fact that the one acquired it. So we'll say, so three is just a nice number to have for the hefker process because it's like one-stop shopping, right? So assuming one of the three acquires the item, you now have two independent witnesses to corroborate the fact that two is the present owner. But Rabbi Shmuel Levi says, while three is nice, at the end of the day, not necessary. A hefker declaration becomes effective even in the presence of one individual. We'll say, if you take a look at the Ran, 3 lines are from the bottom. Ule'inyan halacha, So how do we paskin in this area? So the Ran says, "Naktinun Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi." We pass like Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. To Amar Dvar Torah filu be'echad havi hefker umatam amru b'shlosha k'dei she'echad zocha shnai meidin hilchach midivrei sofrim eino hefker ad sheyafker b'fnei shlosha. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. So the way the Ran understands the sugi is like this. The Ran says that the halacha is midoraisa. You can make an object hefker even in the presence of one person. But midrabanan, you need three. Midrabanan, you need three. Why? Because this way one could acquire and two could go ahead and testify that the other has acquired the item. So we'll say, so okay, let's wrap up this sugya halacha lamaisa. So we'll say, so first of all, let's just go in order. So halacha number one, the Mishnah. Who do we paskin like? Rabbi Yossi or the Rabbanon, right? Reuven made a neder, Shimon, you can't get any benefit from me. They are now traveling together on the road. Reuven has food, Shimon doesn't have food. Reuven can't give food directly to Shimon. Why? Because of the neder. So what's the shaila? He wants to put it down on the ground, make it hefker. Does that work or not? Here we go. Rambam, Hilchos Nedarim, Perek Zayin Halacha Yudalid. Hayu mahalchin b'derech ve'im lama yochal. Reuven and Shimon are walking on the road. Reuven made neder, Shimon can't get benefit from him, and Shimon has nothing to eat. Reuven has food. No sein la'achar mishum matana. Fala muterba. So the ideal, what's the ideal? The ideal is if they're traveling with Levi, then what does Reuven do? Give the food to Levi. Now it belongs to Levi. Levi can give it to Shimon and not do it with Reuven anymore. That's the ideal. And the Mishnah said that as well. What if there's not a third party? Levi's not there. Here we go. Get ready. Maniach ala sela. The Rambam paskins like the Rabbanon that Reuven has the ability to put the food on the rock, say the food is hefker, and now Shimon has the ability to go ahead and take it. So Rabbi says, we paskin like the Rabbanon. We paskin like the Rabbanon, which means that in the mechanics of hefker as well, we paskin like the Rabbanon. Namely, that when you make something hefker, you do not retain ownership on that until the second party comes along and takes ownership of it. Rather, once you make something hefker, what's the halacha? You have nothing to do with that item anymore. And therefore, again, when the other party comes along and acquires it, they're not acquiring it from you. Who are they acquiring it from? Who are they acquiring? Hefker. And therefore, halacha pass like the Rabbanon. Therefore, in this case where Shimon has no food, Reuven can simply put it on the rock, right, or on the ground, wherever, and say again, Hare elu mufkarin, this food is hefker. Right? Reuven's out. Shimon could come and take the food, and he's not taking anything from Reuven. Excellent. That's halacha number one on both sides. Halacha number two. What about this 3-day thing with hefker? Right? You make something hefker. The Gemara said within the first 3 days, you could walk back your hefker declaration. Is that true? Halacha l'maiser. And I said, listen to this exciting stuff. Hilchos Nedarim, Perek Beis Halacha Yud Zayin. Hamafkir es sadeh v'lo zacha ba'adam. We'll say, I make my field hefker. No one else has claimed the field. Kol shloshi yamim yachol achzerbo. I will say, for the first 3 days after you made it hefker, you could walk back your declaration. I will say, so to be clear, what does this mean? Not that you made it hefker, of course, you could reacquire anything from hefker. What it's saying is, for the first 3 days after declaration, if you reacquire that field, or you could reacquire that field and void your hefker declaration. I will say, now, there are 2 ways to read that statement. After you make a field hefker, within 3 days, if you reacquire it, you can make that declaration void. Or to say a little bit differently, if you reacquire that field within 3 days, you have what? You have voided your hefker declaration, right? Why have you voided your hefker declarations? Once again, to avoid exploitation, right? I will say, right, 2 ways to read this statement. I make my field hefker. First way to read it is, within 3 days, I can walk back. I could void that hefker declaration by reacquiring the field. What that really means is, if you make your field hefker and you reacquire it within 3 days, then what? You have voided that declaration. Why? Because I will say, because out of concern that the only reason you made it hefker was why? To go ahead and avoid, it's the tax shelter, to go ahead and avoid giving meiser. If you make it hefker, reacquire within 3 days, that shows that you never really had intention to really make it hefker. Therefore, it's void. It's 2 different ways to read the statement. But bottom line, I want to point out, this concept is true. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, if you make something hefker, no one else acquires it, within the first 3 days, you can walk back that declaration. And therefore, again, when you take it back, so to speak, you are avoiding the Hefker declaration as if it's never been Hefker. And therefore, again, obviously, it becomes subject to Trumas and Meisers. Good. Halacha l'maisa number 3. Halacha l'maisa number 3. How does Hefker work? Does Hefker have to be made in front of 2, 3, or 1 person? So, the Rambam, Hilchos Nedarim. Same parak base halacha tezayin. Here we go. Hamafkir es hakarka. Okay, good. Hamafkir es hakarka. Kalakodim v'hichsik bazacha. So we'll say if you make something hefker, and whoever acquires it first has acquired it. Now watch this. Din Torah afilu hifkir b'fnei echad harei ze hefker v'niftar min ha'maisros k'mo she's go. So we'll say salacha midaraisa. Hefker only needs to be made in the presence of one individual. In other words, we'll say the operative piece here is you do have to make an item Hefker in front of someone, right? So in other words, someone has to be aware about your Hefker declaration. But midaraisa, even if you only made the item Hefker in front of one person, it's Hefker. And therefore, by extension, the item is now potter from Maisrus. Aval, here we go, midivrei sofrim, Eno hefker at sheyafker b'fnei shlosha kedei sheyeh echad zocha imratza v'ashnayim mu'idim. I will say midrabanan, hefker should really be made in the presence of 3 people. So we'll say like Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. So midaraisa, hefker works even in the presence of 1 person. Midrabanan, ultimately again, even in the midrabanan, really need 3. Why 3? Again, because this way you have 1 person who could acquire and 2 people who could attest to the fact that the acquisition itself actually occurs. So I'll say to now 3 important nuggets of halacha l'maisa information. Good. All right, this is interesting, other interesting piece, but let's go weiter. So we'll say, so again, Amud Beis. Here we go. First of all, Hadron Allah, Be'ein Ben Amudar, we'll say, Mazel Tov. Let us continue. So the Gemara goes weiter. We'll say Mishnah, new Mishnah, or at least actually, the Mishnah extends already onto Memvav Mudalef. Well, at least begin the Mishnah. Hashutfin, I'm going to say very interesting case here. Hashutfin shenadru hana zemizeh. All right, so we'll say here we have an interesting case. What's our interesting case? Partners. Let's call them Reuben and Shimon, right? So Reuben and Shimon are partners in a field. Now, what did Reuben and Shimon do? They made a neder not to derive benefit one from the other. Shenadru hana zemizeh. So, right? Reuben made a neder, he's not getting benefit from Shimon. Shimon made a neder, he's not getting benefit from Reuben. Fine. Or I will say, remember, these nedarim could also be phrased as Reuben made a neder that Shimon can't get benefit from him. Shimon made a neder that Reuben can't get benefit from him. Fine. What's the halacha? Asurin likones lachatzer. So I will say, now here's what's interesting. They own a chatzer, right? They own a field together. Right? So Reuben and Shimon, in other words, remember, they're shutfin. Why are they shutfin? Because they own property jointly. So now they have a field. So now what's the shaila? So now they have a joint field. So now, is Reuben allowed? So the shaila is either party permitted to enter into the field? Because after all, again, when you enter, right, if Reuben enters into the field, we'll say, he's benefiting from who? From Shimon, right? Because it's a jointly owned field. Shimon enters into the field, he's benefiting from Reuben. Therefore, again, the Tanakama, the first opinion of the Mishnah says, if they made an neder not to benefit from one another, ultimately asurin likanes. They can't walk in. Neither could walk into the field. Because by definition, since it's a jointly owned field, if Reuven walks in, he's benefiting somehow from Shimon. If Shimon walks in, he's benefiting somehow from Reuven. They both say, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, Omer, zen nichnas l'sof shalo, vezen nichnas l'sof shalo. On the other hand, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says, no. Reuven is permitted to enter into his part of the field. Shimon's permitted to enter into his part of the field. Now, what's going on over here? So take a look at Rashi. This is really quite interesting. Feel free to peruse that Ran on your own. Right? That's your homework. Because we're going to stick with Rashi today. So look at Rashi says over here. Asur likanes lachatzer. So Rashi says, B'chatzer shel shneihem, t'chol chad aser b'drisas haregel shel chaveiro. So we'll say, now watch this. Because again, the Tanakhama says, look, we'll say, how do we view ownership? So we'll say, there are 2 ways to view ownership. Let's talk about this outside for just a moment, right? Ownership can be viewed as Reuven and Shimon own every single inch of land in joint ownership, right? Everything is joint ownership. So the Tanakama says, because every single thing is joint ownership, Reuven, if you take a step onto that field, what are you stepping on? What are you stepping on? Property that you own jointly together with Shimon, right? Every parcel of every inch of land, right, is owned jointly. So I'll say, what is that a function of? The kasavar ein breira. I'll say, remember again, breira. What's breira? What's breira? Breira is the concept of excellent. Is there a concept of retroactive clarification or not? So I will say, now watch this. Essentially, what we say is like this. We know that in the field, in reality, what does Reuven own? What does Reuven own? 50%. What does Shimon own? 50%. I will say the shaila is, can you define that 50%? In other words, can I separate out the 50% from one another? Or do we say, no, every single piece of land, by definition, is 50% Reuven's and 50% Shimon's? Now, when they own it jointly and together, generally, we say, it doesn't matter. In other words, it doesn't matter. They're partners, so they're partners in everything. In this case, it matters. Why? Because now they're partners, but they made a neder not to benefit from each other. So I'll say, let's work backwards. If you hold yesh breira, if you hold that there's a concept of retroactive clarification, then what? Then, which is what Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says, then both Reuven and Shimon could walk on the field. Why? Because I will say, when Reuven takes a step on the field, what do we say? It's been retroactively clarified that the part of the field that Reuven is standing on belongs to who? Belongs to Reuven. Belongs to Reuven. That's what Breira does. Breira is able to create a sense of retroactive clarification. Reuven only owns 50%. Which 50% does he own? Which 50% does he own? The part that he's standing on right now. That's part of his 50%. And by the way, when he takes another step, what does Breira say? That's also part of the 50% that he owns. That's Breira. So Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says, no. Reuven and Shimon could both go ahead and traverse the field. That's not a problem. Why? Because Yesh Breira, and Breira will say wherever they are standing, that's the part that they own. The Tanakama holds in Breira. So we'll say if you hold in Breira, then what? What does that tell you? There is a defined 50% amount that Reuven owns, and a defined 50% part that Shimon owns. But because at the end of the day, they've never dissolved their partnership, that means what? Every single part of that 50% of Reuven is intertwined with the 50% of Shimon. There's no, right now, before they force a dissolution, there's no way to extricate those partnership interests from one another. Therefore, if Reuven were to step on the field, by definition, he's stepping on a part of the field that he owns in joint partnership with Shimon. Therefore, if he steps on there, ultimately what? He's benefiting from Shimon. So we'll say, now let's see it inside. Rashi says, Rashi says, because we'll say every single step that Reuven takes, he's stepping on a part of the field that he owns together with Shimon. The Kasavar, the Tanakama holds ein breira. There is no retroactive clarification. The Amar, hai lechelek chavera ayol, v'hai lecherek chavera. So we'll say if you hold breira, then you could disentangle the partnership interests, right? It's retroactively clarified that this piece of land that Reuven is standing on is part of his 50%. And when Shimon comes on the field, the part of the field that he's standing on is retroactively clarified that that's his 50%. And Shalom al Yisrael. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov omer nichnas tekasavar yesh breira. So we'll say, so incredible. Ultimately, again, that will be the fundamental machlokes. So we'll say, let's just read another line, top of Memvav. However, we'll say, everyone agrees, Ushnehem asrum lahamid rechayim v'tanor. We'll say, here's what's interesting. Although there is a machlokes about whether or not Reuven can walk on the field or Shimon can walk on the field, everyone agrees. The Tanakama and Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, that neither party has the ability to use the field in a more concrete, long-term fashion. So, for example, neither of them could use a mill on the field. Neither of them could put an oven on the field. Neither of them could raise chickens on the field. Because Rabbi said the ideal is if you look at the Ran on the left-hand side, Ushnein asrum lahamid rechayim v'tanor legadol tanagolim. The afagav darminum perak chaskas abatim the shutfina amoda kadei lo kapti mikol makom ikapti chol naakev ze al ze. Now, we're going to see. In general field ownership, partners are not makbid on each other. So, in other words, Reuven and Shimon are partners. Reuven wants to put an oven already. He wants to put his pizza oven on the field. Shimon is not makbid. But I will say, if Shimon wanted to be makbid and said, hey, you can't put that oven there, I will say Shimon could block that. because Shimon could block it, therefore in this case of where they're mudr hana from one another, you can't, essentially what the Mishnah is saying is, neither partner could do something that the other partner could technically block under normal circumstances. So halacha l'maisa, whereas there is a machlokes regarding the ability to walk on the field, everyone agrees that any more intense usage is going to be usher under this particular circumstance. Rabbi say, shkoyach. We'll stop over here for today. What a week of beautiful accomplishment. Mazdam, I'm finishing the parak. Mazdam, I'm beginning the new parak. We'll say shkoyach. Make sure you get one.